What if the greatest secret of a kingdom, the key to its rise and fall, was not hidden in a treasury vault or a political treaty, but within the very body of its king? This is the story of a secret etched not in parchment, but in flesh, a biological tragedy that held an empire hostage, and a truth so disturbing that history itself conspired to bury it in the shadowy archives of the Vatican. We journey back to 19th century Spain, a dynasty in decline, where the Bourbon bloodline had grown thin and perilous through generations of inbreeding. Into this world of gilded decay was born Ferdinand VII, a prince destined for the throne, yet cursed by a cruel jest of genetics. He was afflicted with an anatomical anomaly of such monstrous proportions that it rendered the most fundamental duty of a king the creation of an heir a private, unspeakable horror. His reign would be defined by this paradox: the immense public power of a monarch at war, with the profound personal powerlessness of a man trapped by his own anatomy. This is more than a lurid tale of royal dysfunction. It is a stark examination of how personal shame can metastasize into national policy, how a sovereign's private torment can orchestrate the suffering of millions. We will explore the lives of the women who became sacrificial lambs to his obsession, the queens whose bodies and minds were shattered in the relentless quest for a successor. We will witness how the fate of a global empire, from the battlefields of Europe to the revolutions in the Americas, was decided not in the council chamber, but in the tormented privacy of the royal bedchamber. This is the story of Ferdinand VII, told not as a footnote of bizarre trivia, but as a profound psychological drama. It is a journey into the dark heart of absolute power, where a king's most intimate secret became his people's most enduring curse. Prepare to uncover the relic in the vault, and the man whose tragic flaw redrew the map of the world. To understand the tragedy of a king, one must first understand the world that made him. The story of Ferdinand VII does not begin with his birth, but centuries earlier, in the gilded, suffocating halls of the Habsburg and Bourbon dynasties. Imagine the Spanish Empire as a magnificent, ancient tapestry, woven with threads of gold and conquest. By the late 18th century, however, its colors had begun to fade. Its threads, once strong, were now frayed and brittle, weakened by a deliberate, centuries-long practice of self-poisoning, royal inbreeding. For generations, the thrones of Europe, particularly Spain, had sought to consolidate power by turning inward, marrying cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, until the royal bloodline became less a river than a stagnant pool. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a visible mark of this genetic decay, was merely the most obvious symptom of a much deeper malady that afflicted the very soul of the dynasty. Into this world of opulent rot, on the 14th of October, 1784, a prince was born at the royal site of San Lorenzo de El Escorial. He was Ferdinand, son of King Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma. The palace of his youth was a masterclass in dysfunction. His father, Charles IV, was a gentle but weak-willed man, whose true passion lay not in the intricate dance of statecraft, but in the simple, bloody thrill of the hunt. He would disappear for days, leaving a vacuum of power that his wife, the formidable and voracious Maria Luisa, was only too eager to fill. The court buzzed with the open secret of her affair with the ambitious Prime Minister, Manuel de Godoy, a daily humiliation that the young prince was forced to witness in silent observation. From the shadows of the throne room, Ferdinand learned his first lessons of power, that it was a thing to be seized, that loyalty was a fool's currency, and that trust was the foundation of ruin. Ferdinand himself was a quiet, watchful child, with large, dark eyes that seemed to absorb the court's duplicity. In these early years, there was little to suggest the monster he would become. Yet, even in the relative calm of his royal childhood, subtle dissonances hinted at a coming storm. A court physician's gaze might linger a moment too long during a routine examination. A pair of servants would fall silent, their whispered conversation cut short the moment the young prince entered a chamber. These were fleeting moments, easily dismissed, but they planted seeds of unease in Ferdinand's mind. He began to feel a vague sense of difference, a disquiet he could not name, a quiet suspicion that some fundamental part of him was a subject of hushed concern. It was a faint, discordant note in the grand symphony of his royal upbringing, a premonition that the curse of his bloodline had chosen a new, and far more intimate, form of expression in him. As boyhood receded, the whispers in the palace corridors found an echo in the terrifying changes within his own flesh, and the vague disquiet of his youth began to sharpen into the acute agony of shame. Nature, it seemed, had reserved its cruelest joke for the future king of Spain. While other aristocratic sons were measured by the classical Greek ideals of refined, modest proportions, Ferdinand's body began to develop in ways that defied medical understanding. His member, the very symbol of his future potency and dynastic duty, grew to proportions that were, by contemporary accounts, almost alien. Hidden away for centuries in Vatican archives, the clinical notes of his physicians struggled to contain their horror, describing an endowment of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that it seemed less a part of a man than a grotesque appendage. This physical reality forged a psychological prison. The prince, intensely aware of his abnormality, became a recluse in his own court. He learned to interpret every glance as mockery, every polite smile as a mask for ridicule. The shame was a physical weight, a hot iron pressed against his soul. It was in this crucible of humiliation that his character was irrevocably warped. The quiet, observant boy vanished, replaced by a secretive, vindictive adolescent. He learned that while he could not control his own body, he could exert absolute control over the bodies of others. Cruelty became his shield. In one infamous incident, a young page, no older than 14, accidentally stumbled upon the prince while he was changing. He saw the secret. For this fleeting, innocent mistake, Ferdinand did not simply dismiss him. He had the boy publicly flogged and his entire family exiled from Madrid. The message was brutal and clear. No one could witness the prince's shame and remain unpunished. His internal monster, born of genetic chance, had begun to claw its way out, demanding tribute in the fear and suffering of those around him. The cruelty that festered in private was soon to be tested on a public stage, for the duty of a prince, regardless of his private hell, was to secure the future of his kingdom. A bride was chosen, an alliance was forged, and a date was set for the sacrificial ritual known as a royal wedding. She was his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, a beautiful and intelligent young woman of 16, raised on romantic notions of her future husband. She had heard his supporters called him El Deseado, the desired Onand. She arrived in Madrid envisioning a fairy tale prince. The wedding itself was a magnificent spectacle, a grand display of Bourbon power designed to mask the rot within, the cathedrals filled with music, the streets with celebration. Ferdinand, charming and attentive in public, played his part to perfection. But royal weddings end, and wedding nights begin. The first sign of trouble came as a quiet, unusual request. Ferdinand's valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting, informing them that special preparations were needed for the royal bedchamber. Soon, servants arrived bearing not rose petals and fine linens, but custom-made cushions of strange shapes, bottles of oils and salves, and implements that seemed more suited to a physician's surgery than a bridal suite. Maria Antonia, sheltered and innocent, understood none of it. She was led to the chamber, a lamb adorned for a sacrifice she could not comprehend. When Ferdinand finally entered and disrobed, her fairy tale shattered. One of her ladies-in-waiting would later write of the moment with trembling horror. Her Majesty began screaming as though she had seen the devil himself. She backed against the wall, pointing and crying, "Monster! Monster!" until we feared she had lost her reason entirely. The one word Ferdinand feared above all others had been spoken. It was the sound of his deepest, most secret terror-given voice. In the chilling echo of that single word, the future of their marriage, and indeed the future of Spain, was decided. The prince had met his bride, but it was the monster who would remain as her husband. The echoes of that scream did not fade with the morning light. They settled into the very stones of the palace, becoming the silent, defining soundtrack of a royal marriage that was, from its first moments, not a union but a state of siege. The immediate aftermath of the wedding night established a new and terrifying reality, a meticulously structured hell governed by dynastic imperatives and personal pathologies. The hope of romance, so briefly held by the young princess, was not merely dead, It was butchered and buried under the cold weight of royal duty. For Ferdinand, Maria Antonia's terror was an unbearable reflection of his own inadequacy, a living testament to the monstrous secret he harbored. But the shame of a prince, when nurtured by absolute power and watered with paranoia, does not blossom into empathy. It curdles into rage, hardening into a shell of impenetrable cruelty. In the twisted logic of his tormented mind, her revulsion was not an understandable reaction to a shocking physical reality. It was a willful act of feminine defiance, a calculated insult to his person, his potency, and his crown. He began to see her not as a fellow victim of his curse, but as its primary accomplice. He could not alter the grotesque architecture of his body, but he could, and he would, break the spirit of the woman who recoiled from it. His private shame was thus projected outward, recast as her public failure. The marriage descended into a grotesque and ritualized nightmare. The royal bedchamber, once a symbol of union and succession, was transformed into a cold, clinical theater, its nightly performances attended by dread and despair. Each attempt at producing an heir was a carefully staged procedure, more akin to surgery than lovemaking, a mechanical act devoid of warmth or affection. The physicians would be consulted, their hushed tones and somber expressions filling the antechambers as they discussed angles, pressures, and lubricants. The specially designed cushions and marital aids, crafted by the finest royal artisans whose skills were perversely repurposed, were now grimly familiar props in their nightly drama. These objects, made of the richest velvet and silk, felt as cold and unyielding as surgical steel. For Maria Antonia, this recurring trauma was a hell from which there was no waking escape. Her vibrant spirit, the one that had charmed the Neapolitan court, began to wither under the relentless assault. Laughter became a foreign language. Her ladies-in-waiting, sworn to secrecy and powerless to intervene, watched in silent horror as their bright young queen began to physically fade. Her eyes, once full of intelligent light, became hollowed and haunted. A constant, nervous tremor took hold of her hands. Her only solace, her only shield against the approaching night, was found in the small, dark bottles provided by the court physician's laudanum, the milk of the poppy, prescribed with clinical detachment to calm her hysterical episodes. At first, it was a medicine, a prescription to endure the unendurable. Soon, it became her sanctuary, her religion. The blessed, blurry veil of the opiate allowed her to detach, to float above her own body as it was subjected to the grim ritual. She began to drift through her days in a drugged haze, a beautiful ghost haunting the gilded cage her life had become, her sharp mind dulled and her soul steeped in a quiet, chemical despair. But this private hell was fueled by a public demand that could not be ignored, the incessant, kingdom-wide cry for an heir. The stability of the Bourbon dynasty rested upon the outcome of these horrific encounters. And so, the grotesque ritual continued, a desperate, nightly gamble against biology itself, a gamble that would soon exact an even bloodier price. Twice, against all rational expectation, the seemingly impossible happened. Maria Antonia conceived. The first time, in 1804, a wave of cautious, almost desperate optimism swept through the Spanish court. Ferdinand's confidence soared, a manic euphoria taking hold of him. He saw it as a victory of his indomitable will, a sign that God had finally bent to his royal desire. His control over his wife intensified. She was no longer a person but a precious vessel, an incubator for his legacy. He dictated her diet, her activity, her very moments of rest, his paranoia seeing potential threats in every shadow. For Maria Antonia, however, the pregnancy was not a time of joy, but 9 months of heightened terror, her body a battleground where hope and trauma waged a silent war. The pregnancy was a fragile thing, rooted in violence and sustained by drugs. In the 4th month, it ended in a devastating torrent of blood and pain, a miscarriage. The official explanation, as recorded by the royal physicians in their emotionless script, was the unusual stresses placed upon Her Majesty's delicate constitution. It was a clinical, bloodless lie, a medical curtain drawn over a scene of unimaginable brutality. The truth, whispered in the darkest corners of the palace, was that Ferdinand's anatomical abnormality made the marital act so violent that Maria Antonia's body, in a final, desperate act of self-preservation, had rejected the fruit of that union. Ferdinand did not see a shared tragedy. He refused to acknowledge his own part in it. Instead, he saw a deliberate act of sabotage. In a private, venomous confrontation, he accused her of treason against the crown and against God, her grief twisted into a crime. His accusations, once confined to the bitterness of his thoughts, now became his primary weapon. He accused her of harboring secret liberal sympathies, of poisoning her own womb with tinctures to deny Spain a proper Catholic heir. He saw her suffering not as a wound to be soothed, but as irrefutable evidence of her betrayal. A year later, the ghastly cycle of hope and despair repeated itself, this time with an even greater patina of cruelty. Maria Antonia conceived again. This time, she was a ghost from the start, her body frail, her mind shrouded in a permanent opiate fog. Through sheer, agonizing will, she carried the child almost to full term, a testament to an endurance born of utter hopelessness. But the delivery was a horror of 19th-century medicine, a butchery of blood and suffering that she barely survived. The child, another daughter, was lost. This second loss, so close to the finish line, broke something essential and irreparable within the young queen. Her addiction to laudanum became absolute. Her grasp on reality, already tenuous, now dissolved completely. She had failed as a wife, failed as a queen, and now, twice over, had failed as a mother. In Ferdinand's cold, unforgiving eyes, her worth as a human being had been utterly extinguished. A queen who could not produce an heir was a political liability. A walking ghost on the throne of Spain was a national embarrassment. For Ferdinand, whose paranoia now saw conspiracies in every rustle of a curtain, his wife's tragic, barren state was beginning to look like a deliberate, treasonous plot. The final act of their shared tragedy was about to unfold, driven by his conviction that the instrument had proven defective and must be discarded. Maria Antonia's final months were spent in a state of near-constant, feverish prayer, not for her health, but for the salvation of her soul. She would spend hours on the cold stone floor of her private chapel, begging a merciless God for forgiveness for sins she couldn't name. She had internalized Ferdinand's accusations so completely that she had come to believe them, to see herself as cursed, her body rejecting the royal seed because of some hidden, unforgivable flaw in her own spirit. She was dying, and she welcomed it. In May of 1806, at the age of only 21, she finally found her liberation. The official cause of death was listed as a fever, a diplomatic fiction. The truth was far darker and more profound. Maria Antonia had died of despair, her body and mind systematically dismantled and destroyed by years of unrelenting sexual trauma, narcotic addiction, and the crushing weight of psychological abuse. She had willed herself to death, her spirit choosing oblivion over one more night in the king's bed. Her death was a shocking event for the court, but the true horror, the final, irrefutable evidence of Ferdinand's monstrous transformation, was revealed in his reaction. There was no grief. While he performed the necessary public pantomime of sorrow, clad in the deepest black and accepting solemn condolences with a perfectly calibrated somber face, privately, the court observed in him an almost palpable sense of relief. The obstacle had been removed. The failed instrument was broken and could now be summarily discarded. The throne room, for Ferdinand, was not a place of mourning, but a space for new calculations. Within weeks, his agents were making discreet inquiries to the courts of Europe about potential second wives, his letters focusing with unnerving specificity on women who had already proven their fertility, on healthy, childbearing widows or princesses from large families. The shocking truth was now laid bare for all with eyes to see. Ferdinand's humanity had been so completely eroded by his festering shame that his wife's death was not a tragedy, but a strategic opportunity. This chilling realization was amplified by the dark rumors that began to circulate through the palace corridors like a poisonous miasma rumors that Maria Antonia had not simply died of a fever, but had been helped toward her end by a subtle poison. The suspicions were fueled by the sudden, highly convenient death of the palace apothecary, just days after the Queen's passing. He was said to have left a cryptic letter, a letter that was immediately seized by Ferdinand's agents and vanished into the labyrinth of state secrets. Whether Ferdinand was a murderer in fact or merely in spirit no longer mattered. In the cold, brutal calculus of his ambition, Maria Antonia's life had become worthless, and her death a welcome and necessary convenience. The monster in the mirror had now fully consumed the man, and he was ready, with renewed and terrifying purpose, to begin his monstrous work anew. While Ferdinand waged a private war within the walls of his palace, a greater conflict was consuming Europe. The name Napoleon Bonaparte was on every tongue, a force of nature redrawing the map of the continent according to his own grand design. In Spain, the dysfunctional court of Charles IV was ripe for implosion. Ferdinand, now a young man hardened by his private humiliations, saw the growing chaos not as a threat, but as an opportunity. His resentment towards his weak father and his mother's powerful lover, Godoy, had festered into a potent political ambition. He became the silent, brooding center of a conspiracy of disgruntled nobles who called themselves the Fernandistas. They saw in him a vehicle for their own power, a symbol of national renewal they could rally behind. They crafted the myth of El Deseado, the desired one, a patriotic prince who would rescue Spain from its corrupt leadership. They did not understand or chose to ignore that the man they sought to place on the throne was motivated not by patriotism, but by a twisted psychological need to project his internal sense of powerlessness onto the world. The conspiracy culminated in October 1807, a clumsy, ill-fated plot to overthrow his own father with the secret backing of Napoleon. When the plot was discovered at the palace of El Escorial, Ferdinand's true character was laid bare for all to see. There was no defiance, no noble stand for his cause or his allies. There was only immediate, groveling cowardice. Dragged before his parents, the prince collapsed. He wept, he begged, and he betrayed every single person who had risked their lives and fortunes for him. He wrote detailed confessions, naming every co-conspirator, revealing every secret communication. While his allies faced imprisonment and exile, Ferdinand, the ringleader, was pardoned by his foolishly doting father. This act of craven betrayal was the turning point, the moment his private moral decay became a public political strategy. It established the defining pattern of his entire reign. He would use people as instruments and discard or destroy them the moment they ceased to be useful. But his treachery had caught the attention of a far greater predator. Napoleon, observing this spectacular display of familial dysfunction from across the Pyrenees, saw a kingdom rotten to the core and ready to fall. In 1808, French troops poured into Spain, not as allies, but as invaders. In a masterfully orchestrated political checkmate at Bayonne, Napoleon forced both Charles IV and Ferdinand VII to abdicate, effectively kidnapping the entire Spanish royal family. Ferdinand had played for a throne and lost everything. The nation was plunged into a bloody war of independence, and the prince, for all his cunning, was now a prisoner. He had lost his crown, but he could not escape his flesh. In his gilded cage at the Château de Valençay in France, Ferdinand would spend the next 6 years discovering new, more scientific forms of humiliation. He had traded the veiled mockery of the Spanish court for the clinical curiosity of his French captors. While back in Spain, brave men and women were fighting and dying in the brutal guerrilla warfare immortalized by the artist Goya, shedding their blood for the myth of El Deseado. The man himself was living a strangely detached existence. He wrote fawning letters to Napoleon, congratulating him on his victories over the very armies fighting for his own restoration. His primary concern was not the fate of his kingdom, but the management of his personal affliction. Freed from the constraints of royal protocol, French physicians, men of the Enlightenment, studied his condition with a dispassionate, scientific rigor that terrified him. His deepest, most guarded shame was examined, measured, and documented in detailed reports that would become part of the Napoleonic Archivesa state secret of his enemy. The humiliation was absolute. He was no longer a king in waiting, but a biological specimen, a living symbol of the decay of the House of Bourbon. When the tide of war finally turned, and Napoleon's empire crumbled, Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814. He was greeted by scenes of ecstatic, almost religious fervor. Crowds wept with joy, throwing flowers before his carriage, desperate to believe that their suffering had served a divine purpose, that their desired one had returned to heal the nation. He smiled and waved, a mask of regal benevolence firmly in place, but behind the mask, the man who returned was more broken, more paranoid, and more cruel than the one who had left. The adulation of the masses did not soothe him. It merely confirmed his belief in his absolute right to rule and to pursue his own obsessions without question. His first priority was not to write a constitution or reward the heroes of the war, but to find a new wife and restart his disastrous quest for an heir. He chose another cousin, his niece, Maria Isabel of Portugal. And with that, the second act of his marital tragedy began, a sequel that would prove to be a double hell. The first time, he had been a prince. His cruelties somewhat checked by the presence of his parents. Now, he was Ferdinand VII, King of Spain by the grace of God and the blood of his people, an absolute monarch with no one to restrain his impulses. The horrors of his first marriage were reenacted, but this time with the full, terrifying force of the state, amplifying his every whim. The screams that echoed from the royal bedchamber were now the screams of a queen, who was not merely married to a monster, but was the monster's absolute property. But when the second marriage proved as barren and traumatic as the first, producing only blood-stained sheets and a terrified, trembling queen, Ferdinand's desperation mutated. His private rituals had failed. His prayers had gone unanswered. His paranoia, now a constant raging fever in his mind, convinced him that the problem was not his body, but the secrecy surrounding it. A new perverse logic took hold. If privacy could not solve his problem, perhaps exposure would. He was about to drag his most intimate shame onto the world stage, a decision that would plunge him, and his new wife, to their lowest point yet. In an act of breathtaking desperation, Ferdinand began to invite foreign medical experts to Madrid. He summoned German anatomists, French physicians, even circus performers who claimed expertise in unusual physical conditions, turning the Spanish court into a grotesque international symposium on his own sexual dysfunction. The royal bedchamber, the most private space in the kingdom, was transformed into a laboratory, a medical theatre where the king's intimate failures were performed before a rotating audience of detached, note-taking observers. For Maria Isabel, this was a new and profound form of torture. She was no longer just the victim of her husband's private assaults, she was now a living specimen in a freak show, her body examined and discussed, her trauma a subject for academic debate. She endured this parade of voyeuristic medical consultations until her mind finally shattered. The young queen, once full of hope, became a silent, haunted figure, her eyes reflecting a horror that no one dared acknowledge. She died in 1818. After 2 years in this hell, her death officially attributed to complications from pregnancy, but the court knew she had simply wasted away from terror and shame. While this macabre theatre unfolded in the palace, Spain itself was dying. The period historians call the ominous decade had begun. The last of the great American colonies were lost forever, the silver and gold that had fueled the empire for 3 centuries gone with them. The national treasury was empty. The people starved in the streets, while their king spent fortunes on foreign sexual consultants. The nation had become a European laughingstock, its decline perfectly symbolized by a ruler whose pathological obsession with his own anatomy rendered him incapable of governing. With the death of his second wife, Ferdinand hit rock bottom. He had no heir. His kingdom was in ruins. He had publicly exposed his deepest, most humiliating secret to the world, only to fail again in the most spectacular fashion. He was utterly alone, a king ruling over a crumbling empire, a man trapped in a body that had defeated him at every turn. All hope, it seemed, was lost. From the ashes of public failure and private despair, a new plan was forged not of passion, but of cold, clinical necessity. There would be a third wife, a third gamble against a fate that had already proven itself to be merciless. The laboratory of the royal bedchamber would be reopened for one final, desperate experiment. In 1819, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony arrived in Madrid, a princess from a land of stern pragmatism. She was not a starry-eyed girl like Maria Antonia, nor a terrified lamb like Maria Isabel. She was a mature, intelligent woman who had been thoroughly, if discreetly, briefed on the king's peculiarities. Their marriage, from its inception, was not a union of hearts, but a clinical partnership, a dynastic project. She approached her duties with the detached precision of a scientist, her personal feelings locked away. For 10 years, they engaged in their scheduled, medically supervised attempts at conception. 10 years. An entire decade of mechanical procedures, of hope rising and falling with the monthly cycle, of a king's desperation hardening into a brittle, obsessive shell. The court watched, waited, and whispered as the king's hair grayed and the kingdom continued to drift, rudderless. Then, in 1829, after a full decade of clinical matrimony had yielded nothing but failure, the impossible happened. A miracle, whispered through the court, then shouted from the rooftops. Maria Josefa was pregnant. The news sent a convulsive shockwave through the Spanish court, a jolt of disbelief followed by frantic celebration. Ferdinand, now 45 years old, a man long resigned to his fate, was thrown into a state of manic, terrifying euphoria. This was the final validation, God's answer to his tormented prayers, a reprieve from a lifetime of shame. But his joy was inseparable from his paranoia, two faces of the same mad coin. He became a man possessed, seeing assassins in every shadow and curses in every cup of wine. He turned the Queen's chambers into a gilded fortress, a prison designed to protect his precious miracle from a hostile world that existed largely in his imagination. Her food was tasted by multiple servants who were then quarantined and observed. Her guards were changed daily. The finest physicians in Europe were summoned, their modern science forced to coexist uneasily with the astrologers, mystics, and charlatans the king also consulted, frantically poring over lunar charts and ancient texts. He supervised every meal, monitored every step, his frantic, obsessive energy creating a suffocating atmosphere of pure terror for the poor woman at its center. The pregnancy progressed under this unbearable scrutiny, a fragile bloom in a poisoned, airless garden. The climax arrived with the sudden violence of a summer storm. In the 7th month, Maria Josefa went into a sudden, chaotic, premature labor. The delivery was not a medical procedure. It was a scene from one of Goya's most fevered nightmares. The birthing chamber descended into chaos, ruled not by the physicians, but by the king's madness. He stormed about, his face pale with sweat and terror, ignoring the pleas of the doctors, shouting contradictory orders based on superstition and fear. He brought holy relics into the room, pressing them to his wife's belly, demanding a miracle from a god who had long since turned his back. It was a scene of unimaginable horror, the frantic, desperate work of the surgeons clashing with the wild-eyed rantings of a mad king. In the midst of this pandemonium, a daughter was born. She was impossibly small, her breath a fragile, momentary flicker in the suffocating room. For a few hours, she lived. For a few hours, Ferdinand was a father. He stared at the infant, his face a grotesque mask of awe and disbelief. And then, as quickly as it had come, the miracle was extinguished. The child died. The loss shattered what remained of Maria Josefa's will to live. Weakened by the horrific delivery and broken by the loss of her child, she succumbed to infection and despair 3 weeks later. Ferdinand, in his final, desperate confrontation with his biological destiny, had achieved a perfect, annihilating failure. He had lost not one, but two, in a single, brutal stroke of fate. The twin deaths of his wife and child did not just break his heart, they broke his mind. The king who had lost his final gamble with God now waged a new war against reality itself. He refused to allow the bodies of his wife and daughter to be buried. He locked their chambers and stood guard outside. For nearly a week, the grandeur of the palace was filled with the creeping sweet stench of decay as Ferdinand, in a state of complete psychotic denial, demanded his horrified physicians perform impossible resurrections. The ministers of his government pleaded with him, their urgent reports on the state of the nation going unread. He paced before the sealed chambers, muttering, praying, and cursing, a wild-eyed ghost haunting his own court, a king held captive by the dead. When he finally, inevitably, was forced by the physical reality of decomposition to accept the truth, he collapsed into a black, silent depression that paralyzed the government. The court, fearing a total collapse of the state, moved with desperate speed. A new plan was hatched, the most cynical and pragmatic of all. They found him a fourth wife, his own niece, the young and vivacious Maria Cristina of Naples, and this time they left nothing to chance. She arrived in Madrid in 1829, already carrying the ultimate diplomatic solution in her womb. She was pregnant, and the child was not Ferdinand's. The fourth wedding was a state-sanctioned farce, a solemn ceremony of deceit that fooled no one in the inner circle of the court. The new queen walked down the aisle with a barely concealed pregnancy, a living symbol of the king's ultimate failure and the court's desperate solution. But Ferdinand, a man so broken and so desperate for an heir that he would embrace any fiction, willingly accepted the deception. He declared the child his own, a gift from a merciful providence who worked in mysterious ways. The birth of a healthy daughter, Isabella, in 1830, should have been the culmination of his life's quest. Instead, it was the beginning of his final, pathetic chapter, a long, slow descent into a hell of his own making. His life became a quiet, sustained torment, a tapestry of mutual deception. He was a father to a child who was not his. He was a husband to a wife who he knew had betrayed him, yet whose presence he required. He was a king whose dynasty now rested upon a biological lie. His paranoia, once a raging fire, now became a dense, suffocating smoke that filled every corner of his existence. He had peepholes, spy holes, drilled into the walls of his wife's chambers, spending hours watching her, a demented voyeur spying on his own sham of a family. He watched her nurse Isabella, he watched her pray, he watched her sleep. And in those quiet moments, he must have been consumed by the most poisonous of inner conflicts, the flicker of paternal love for the child who secured his dynasty, immediately soured by the galling resentment that she was the living proof of another man's potency and his own lifelong impotence. He was a king, a father, a husband, and he was none of them. He was merely the custodian of a lie and the chief warden of his own gilded, psychological prison. But even a king's paranoia cannot hold back the finality of the grave. As Ferdinand's body finally succumbed to a lifetime of stress, anxiety, and torment, his death in 1833 promised a peace he never knew in life. Yet, it also unlocked one last, secret chapter to his story, a chapter to be read not by courtiers, but by surgeons, with a scalpel for a pen. In a secret autopsy, conducted by physicians who had spent their careers battling this very mystery, the full, stunning truth of his condition was confirmed. His member, which measured a staggering length, was found to be deformed by internal scarring and cartilaginous growths that made normal function, and thus natural conception, a near impossibility. More tragically, the physicians discovered the faint, silvery traces of old, poorly healed scars on the organ-physical evidence of pathetic, secret attempts at self-surgery, likely performed with a penknife or some other crude tool, in the desperate, lonely agony of his teenage years. Here was the final heartbreaking proof of his lifelong private war, a boy so ashamed of his own body that he had tried to carve it into normalcy himself. In the end, Ferdinand's personal tragedy metastasized to become the tragedy of his nation. His singular obsession had blinded him, while a global empire, built over 3 centuries, slipped through his fingers. His true legacy was not peace or prosperity, but the bitter, bloody civil wars, the Carlist Wars, that would tear Spain apart for generations to come. Those wars were fought over the legitimacy of his daughter, Isabella II, whose succession broke the traditional male line of inheritance. This break was a direct political consequence of his personal, biological failure to produce a male heir. His most private dysfunction became the casus belli for a century of Spanish conflict. His story is a brutal, unforgettable lesson in the nature of absolute power, how it can amplify a single, private flaw until it shatters the lives of millions. He was both a monster and a victim, a perpetrator of immense cruelty and the subject of a relentless biological curse that he never understood. The shame that began in the body of one man ultimately corrupted the body politic of an entire nation. The anatomical secret, so carefully guarded in his life and now preserved in a vault, serves as a final, chilling metaphor, a testament to how the most intimate, human frailties can, under the terrible, magnifying weight of a crown, become a destructive force of history, far too tragic for time to ever truly heal. And so, the story of Ferdinand VII comes to a close, leaving us in the quiet, contemplative shadow of its immense tragedy. It serves as a chilling reminder that behind the grand sweep of history, the wars, the treaties, the rise and fall of empires often lie the most intimate, desperate, and fragile of human struggles. The vulnerability of a single person, when magnified by the terrible weight of a crown, can become a weapon of mass destruction, leaving scars not just on a family, but on the soul of a nation for centuries to come. He was, in the end, both a victim of a biological curse he never chose, and the cruel perpetrator of a reign of terror he built to conceal it. This exploration of a psyche warped by power and shame leads us to a profound and unsettling question, and we are genuinely interested to hear your thoughts on this in the comments below. History has given us many monsters. There are the flamboyant tyrants whose malice is a spectacle of overt, almost performative cruelty. But then there are figures like Ferdinand, whose tyranny was not born of grandiose ambition, but of a small, pathetic, and deeply human wound. So, which spectre should we fear more in the halls of power? The roaring lion, whose intentions are clear for all to see, or the quiet serpent, coiled around a secret shame, willing to poison the entire world just to protect its own wounded pride? The complex conversations that unfold from questions like these are a vital part of what we aim to foster here. If you believe, as we do, that history is the ultimate psychological drama, and that untangling the motivations of these complex figures is essential to understanding our own world, then we invite you to become a permanent part of this community. Taking a moment to like this video sends a powerful message that these are the stories that matter to you. Subscribing to the channel ensures that you are with us on every expedition into the past. And we encourage you to ring that notification bell, as it's the surest way to guarantee you never miss a single chapter of the human story we are attempting to tell together. While you wait for our next story, you can continue this exploration into the fragile minds of monarchs. Our feature on the madness of King George III examines a different kind of royal affliction, not of the body, but of the mind, and reveals how the mental collapse of one man nearly shattered the British Empire at the very height of the American Revolution. It's a fascinating parallel to Ferdinand's tale of private torment and public consequence, and you can find it by clicking the link on your screen now. Thank you for joining us on this journey.